My name is Helen Bradford. I am 72 years old and I live in a grand, crumbling house on the outskirts of Waverly Falls, a town so old the trees remember things better than the people do. I didn't always live alone here. Once it was a home loud with music and quarrels and Sunday roasts so big they seemed to make the walls sigh. Once it was full of dreams. Now it's just me. And Calvin. My son. Calvin turned 40 this past March. I remember because I baked him a chocolate cake with espresso ganache, his favorite, and set it on the kitchen table with candles he refused to blow out. He sat there slouched and glassy-eyed, poking at the frosting with a fork, scrolling through his phone while I stood like a ghost nearby. When I asked if he wanted to invite any friends over, he shrugged. Nah. They're busy. Busy, sure. Some of those so-called friends are the reason I keep locking the liquor cabinet. You might be wondering why a 40-year-old man still lives with his mother. Believe me, I wonder too. It wasn't supposed to be this way. When Calvin was a child, he was bright, curious, golden. James and I gave him everything, the best clothes, the newest gadgets, every opportunity we could afford. We paid for private school, for music lessons he never practiced, for a car he crashed within 6 months of college. We weren't just parents. We were architects of his comfort. After James passed away, a heart attack at 77, sitting right there in his worn leather chair at the restaurant, I thought maybe grief would jolt Calvin into life. Responsibility. Purpose. I thought he would step up, help me run Bradford's Hearth, our family steakhouse and pride of Waverly Falls. Instead, he retreated further into the shell he'd built, pouring whiskey into the cracks. I tried everything. I offered him a managerial role. I offered to pay for courses in business, cooking, anything he wanted. I even suggested he travel, see the world, find himself, like the young men in glossy magazines who traded cubicles for adventure. Why would I leave? He said once, leaning back in the chair that used to be James. Everything I need's right here. What he needed apparently was my pension, my patience, and my prayers. Sometimes I wonder if this is my punishment. If somewhere along the way, by cushioning his every fall, I robbed him of the muscles he needed to stand on his own. You don't think of these things when you're tying tiny shoes or saving for a gaming console. You think you're doing right by them. You think love is enough. The days bleed into one another now. I rise early, dress in pressed slacks and blouses older than Calvin's maturity, and drive to Bradford's Hearth to oversee the books. It's a grand old restaurant, all dark woods and velvet booths and a wine list thick as a Bible. The wealthy come from miles around for our steaks, our truffle potatoes, our bourbon bread pudding. They praise the family legacy, without knowing it's a legacy Calvin has no interest in touching. Most nights I come home to find him sprawled on the living room couch, a bottle within reach, the television casting flickering shadows on his unshaven face. Once or twice I've caught him crying, head in his hands, but he brushes it off if I approach. Leave it, Ma, he says. Always Ma, never Mom anymore. Ma sounds dismissive, like a housekeeper's title. I've taken to writing letters to James, little notes I tuck into a wooden box on my nightstand. I tell him about the day, about how the azaleas he planted are blooming wild and unruly, about how the house feels heavier with each passing month, about how I'm tired, bone tired, of loving someone who doesn't seem to even see me anymore. But tonight something feels different. The house is too quiet even for us. Calvin didn't come home. At first, a flash of hope, maybe he's found a job, a girl, a plan. Maybe he's finally left to start his life. But as the grandfather clock ticks its stern judgment through the empty halls, a knot forms in my gut. When the phone finally rings, shrill, splitting the silence, I know before I even answer it that whatever comes next will tear apart the fragile, exhausted tapestry I've been trying so hard to keep stitched together. Mrs. Bradford? The voice is low, apologetic. I'm calling from County General. It's about your son. And just like that, my knees buckle. The real story, the one I've been trying not to tell myself, has finally begun. The road to the county hospital is blurred headlights and stop signs that I barely remember. The city looks different at night, empty, as if the buildings themselves have stopped breathing. The hospital stands on the edge of the Waverly Falls, an old brick building with too little light and too many memories. This is where James left me many years ago. This is where life seems to end. I park crookedly in the ambulance parking lot and stumble through the glass doors, my heart beating in my chest like a butterfly trying to escape from a jar. Helen Bradford, I breathe to the woman at the desk. I'm here for my son. Calvin. She types on the keyboard with her long coral-colored nails, then gives me a look I've seen too many times in my life, the look that says someone has just died. This way, ma'am. The hallway smells of antiseptic and despair. Every fluorescent light seems louder than it should be. Passing by the curtain rooms, I notice a young man holding a broken arm, an old woman whispering prayers to the ceiling. Life is quietly falling apart, seam by seam. When we reach room 18, the nurse pulls back the curtain. There he is. Kelvin lies on a narrow bed, pale and motionless, only the slight rise and fall of his chest indicating that he is still clinging to life. Tubes protrude from his hands. Machines flash and hum around him. His face, once boyish even in its stubbornness, now looks beaten, broken, covered in bruises. What happened? I whisper, my voice trembling and breaking. The nurse sighs. He passed out at the Langley bar. His blood alcohol level was, she hesitates, well above the legal limit. And something else. Something else. There were capsules in his system, she says softly. We're running a full toxicology panel, but it looks like it wasn't just alcohol. I blink, not understanding. He tried to. I can't finish the sentence. She puts her hand on my shoulder. We don't know yet. Sometimes it's accidents. Sometimes it's a cry for help. A cry for help. The words pierce my chest and stick there, sharp and painful. I sink down onto a plastic chair next to his bed, my knees aching, my hands shaking on my knees. Kelvin, my Kelvin. All these years of arguments, slamming doors, exhausting pleas, and I never noticed. I saw laziness, not sadness. I saw anger, not fear. I saw failure in his development, but maybe he felt failure in his life. The doctor arrives, lively and kind, explaining something I can barely hear. Tests. Monitoring. Maybe a psychiatric evaluation if he survives. I sit there until the clock blurs, until my back hurts from the hard chair, until the machines lull me into a half-sleep. In this silence, under the pale light of the hospital, a terrible thought forms in my head. A soft noise snaps me out of my stupor. Kelvin's fingers twitch. I lean forward, my heart pounding. His lips part, dry and cracked. One word escapes him. I'm sorry. Then he sinks back into silence. The problem is that it deceives you. It convinces you that after the worst, recovery will surely follow. For a few weeks after he was discharged from the hospital, it almost seemed true. Kelvin became quieter, gentler. He said thank you when I brought him soup. Once he even kissed me on the forehead, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. His cheeks filled out again. He started shaving. I'm fine, Mom, he said, smiling crookedly as he put on his old leather jacket to go out for the evening. Better than fine. And how I wanted to believe him. But Waverly Falls is a small town. Rumors spread faster than the river after spring rains. And I started hearing things. About Calvin at Langley, about the new faces, rougher faces, that sat at his table, slipping him drinks and whispering to each other. He came home later and later. Some nights he didn't come home at all. I sat by the window, watching the dark silhouette of the Bradford's heart sign swing in the distance, pretending not to notice the clock ticking toward midnight. Toward dawn. When he finally returned, he reeked of cigarette smoke and stale beer. His eyes were glassy again, and his words, if he spoke at all, were broken and cold. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I saw the boy he once was. When he laughed too loudly at an old Western. When he kissed me on the top of my head, half asleep, out of habit. But those moments passed like summer storms, leaving only wet remnants of hope behind. I tried to talk to him once. I stood in the kitchen doorway, drying my hands with a towel, gathering all my courage. Kelvin, maybe you should, I began. He didn't even look up from his phone. Mom, don't start. Everything's fine. Okay. That word scratched my ears like gravel. Okay, is what people say when their lives are falling apart like old plaster, but they're too proud or too tired to admit it. One night, I woke up to the light of headlights flashing across my bedroom wall. I went to the window and saw Calvin getting out of a rusty pickup truck I didn't recognize. He leaned against it, laughing at something someone in the darkness inside had said. Then he waved casually toward the house and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there long after the pickup truck drove away, the cold seeping through the glass and chilling me to the bone. Everything's fine, he said. But I knew better. I knew in my gut that this wasn't going to end well. It started small, as these things often do. An extra receipt missing from the restaurant ledger. A delivery of prime beef canceled without my knowledge. Bottles of wine missing from the cellar. At first, I chalked it up to mistakes, the kind that happen in any busy place, especially an old institution like Bradford's Hearth. But then I saw Calvin one afternoon, standing by the back entrance with two men I didn't recognize. One wore a battered leather vest with patches I couldn't quite make out. The other had a cigarette tucked behind one ear and a sly, permanent smirk. They didn't see me at first. I watched from behind the kitchen screen door as Calvin handed one of them a thick envelope, his movements jittery, his smile too tight. When he finally noticed me, his face drained of color. He barked something at the men, who laughed and sauntered off toward the gravel lot. "Ma," he said, coming toward me, arms outstretched like he could block my view of what I'd already seen. "It's nothing. Just friends." Friends. The word burned in my ears. That night, after closing, I went through the books again. My hands shook with every page I turned. The numbers didn't lie. Someone was bleeding us dry. It wasn't just steaks and wine missing. It was cash from the till, from private bookings, from catered events. Small amounts, but over time they added up to something ugly. And Calvin, my own son, was at the center of it. The confrontation happened 2 nights later. I waited for him to stumble in, waited until he dropped his keys noisily on the entryway table and flopped onto the couch. "Calvin," I said, standing over him. My voice was low, colder than even I expected. "We need to talk." He groaned, threw an arm over his eyes. "Ma, not now." Now, I insisted. When he finally looked at me, something in his face, some small squirming guilt, told me the truth before he even opened his mouth. "You've been stealing from the restaurant," I said. He sat up, blinking hard. "Borrowing," he slurred. "Just borrowing. I was gonna pay it back." "With what?" I snapped. "Your good intentions? Your promises." His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. I pressed on. "Those men, those friends, what are you tangled up in, Calvin? Drugs? Debt? Worse." His face hardened. "You don't understand. You never did." "You're right," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't understand how the boy I raised to be better than this has turned into a stranger." He stood suddenly, knocking over a lamp. The crash echoed through the house. "I'm not a kid anymore, Ma," he shouted. "You don't get to control me." "Control you?" I whispered. "I'm trying to save you. And the legacy your father and I bled for." He glared at me, breathing hard, fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might hit something, the wall, the table, even me. But instead, he just laughed. A low, bitter laugh that chilled me to my marrow. "Save it for someone who cares," he muttered. Then he grabbed his jacket and slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, at the space he had left behind. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. Maybe my son, my beautiful, broken boy, was beyond saving. Maybe I had to start thinking about saving myself. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open before me, the numbers blurring together under the low hum of the overhead light. The house was too big, too hollow, each creak of the floorboards reminding me that I was alone, even when Calvin was here. Especially when Calvin was here. By dawn, I had made my decision. I dressed carefully, pulling on the gray slacks and navy sweater James used to call my war uniform, the outfit I wore when something hard had to be done. I stared at myself in the mirror for a long moment, seeing the lines on my face etched deeper than I remembered, the tired set of my mouth. Then I grabbed my keys and drove into town. Bradford's hearth stood quiet in the early morning fog, its dark wood and stained glass windows glowing faintly under the streetlights. I unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and marched straight into the office. I spent hours going through the books. Every receipt, every invoice, every crooked number. I documented everything, every missing dollar, every suspicious transaction. I printed copies and placed them in a manila folder. And then I made another decision. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Miriam Sloan, the daughter of the late Judge Sloan, who'd once been a regular at the hearth and whose sharp mind was only matched by her sharper sense of right and wrong. "I need to protect the restaurant," I told her. "From my own son." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Miriam said quietly, "Come by my office. Today, we'll figure this out." I hung up the phone with shaking hands. The betrayal felt like acid in my veins. But the alternative, losing Bradford's hearth to Calvin's recklessness, letting James' legacy rot under the weight of his son's failures, was worse. When I returned home that afternoon, Calvin was passed out on the couch, snoring gently, an open beer can resting precariously on the armrest. The television blared some old action movie, gunfire and explosions echoing through the house like cruel jokes. I stood there, watching him, memorizing the way he looked, unkempt, unmoored, unrepentant. My son. My sorrow. I turned off the television, picked up the beer can, and covered him with a blanket. There would be a time for confrontation. For ultimatums. But not yet. It didn't take long for Calvin to sense something was wrong. At first, it was small things. The new accountant I quietly hired to manage Bradford's hearth's finances. The sudden tightening of the cash drawer, the inventory checks happening more often, more strictly. New locks installed on the liquor cabinets without explanation. He began coming home even less, sometimes staying away for days. When he did show up, it was with new bruises, a new edge to his voice, a jitteriness that made my stomach twist into knots. I knew that look. It wasn't just alcohol anymore. It was something deeper, more corrosive. One evening, just as the sun sank behind the hills and bathed the town in heavy shadows, Calvin stumbled into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He dropped into a chair with a thud and glared at me like I was some stranger who'd wronged him. "You're shutting me out," he said, accusing. I wiped my hands carefully on a towel, buying time. "I'm protecting what's left," I replied, my voice even. He laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "Protecting it from me? Your own son. From whoever you've become," I said. There it was, the crack in the dam, the truth bleeding out whether either of us wanted it to or not. His fists balled on the table. "You think you're better than me? You think you're some kind of saint sitting in this dusty old house playing queen of the ruins?" I met his gaze steadily. "I think I've spent my whole life cleaning up after you. And I'm tired, Calvin. Tired of pretending love fixes everything." He pushed away from the table, the chair screeching against the floor. "You'll regret this," he said under his breath, the threat barely disguised. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But not tonight." He stormed out without another word, slamming the door so hard the windows shook in their frames. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me. Every scraped knee I'd kissed, every science fair I'd stayed up helping him with, every late-night drive to pick him up when he'd gotten in trouble, all of it brought me here. To a hollow kitchen and a sun I could no longer reach. The following days slipped past in a grim, colorless fog. Calvin didn't come home. Not once. And yet, his absence filled the house more than his presence ever had, a gaping wound I could not ignore. Late one night, the phone rang. I startled so badly that the glass in my hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Heart hammering, I picked up the receiver. "Mrs. Bradford," a voice said. Male. Tense. "This is Officer Reynolds with the Waverly Falls Police Department. We need you to come down to the station. It's about your son." The world tilted. When I arrived, the fluorescent lights of the station seemed to hum with judgment. Calvin sat slumped in a plastic chair, a split lip, one handcuffed wrist chained to the bench. "Public intoxication," the officer said quietly, leading me inside. "Minor property damage. We're cutting him a break, Mrs. Bradford, but there's something you should see." He handed me a clear evidence bag. Inside was a small crumpled packet. Drugs. Not just whiskey anymore. Not just laziness. Something worse. Something hungry. "We can't prove intent to distribute," the officer said. "Not yet. But his so-called friends, they're bad news. Real bad." I turned my head slowly toward Calvin. He looked up at me through swollen eyes and for a moment, just a moment, I saw the little boy who used to beg me for one more bedtime story. But that boy was gone. "Take him home," the officer said. "But be careful, Mrs. Bradford. Be careful." Of my own son. I drove him home in silence. He leaned his forehead against the window, muttering apologies too soft for me to catch. When we reached the driveway, he didn't move to get out. "You hate me," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and something uglier. "I don't hate you," I whispered. "But I can't save you, Calvin. Not if you won't even try." He said nothing, just stared out into the darkness. I left him there in the passenger seat while I went inside. And for the first time since James died, I locked the door behind me. Because love, as I was learning, isn't always enough to keep the monsters out. Sometimes the monster is already living under your roof. The days that followed were brittle, stretched thin over a growing sense of dread I couldn't shake. Calvin came and went without speaking, moving through the house like a ghost with mud on its boots. I barely recognized him anymore, the sharp set of his jaw, the furtive glances over his shoulder, the way he avoided my eyes like they burned him. I stopped asking where he was going. I stopped leaving food out for him. I had begun to accept, in the deepest parts of me, that the son I loved might never come back. Then came the night that shattered what little hope I had left. It was close to midnight when I heard the noise, a scraping at the back door, soft but insistent. I crept down the hallway in my slippers, heart pounding against my ribs. Peeking through the curtain, I saw two figures outside. Not Calvin. Strangers. Both wore heavy jackets despite the warm night air. One of them turned toward the porch light just enough for me to see a jagged scar slicing through his eyebrow. The other carried something heavy in his hand, a crowbar. Before I could move, the door shook in its frame. Instinct took over. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers, whispering my address to the dispatcher before she could even ask. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." The minutes stretched like hours. The door groaned under their weight. I backed away, gripping the phone so hard it left dents in my palm. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Red and blue lights washed over the yard. Sirens cut through the night. The men bolted into the woods behind the house just as the officers arrived, shouting and giving chase. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the cordless phone dangling from my hand. It took 3 officers to calm me down enough to make a statement. Officer Reynolds was among them, his jaw tight with anger. "Mrs. Bradford," he said, voice low, "we recognized one of them. He's been seen around with Calvin." The world tilted again. "What does that mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "It means," Reynolds said carefully, "that your son might owe people money he can't pay. And they're not asking politely anymore." The officers swept the property, found scuff marks by the windows, footprints in the soft earth near the garden. No real damage, not yet, but the message was clear. Calvin hadn't just endangered himself. He brought danger to my doorstep. When he finally stumbled home the next evening, reeking of sweat and cheap whiskey, I was waiting for him in the living room, my arms crossed, my face carved from stone. "We were robbed," I said flatly. He blinked, slow and unfocused. "What?" "Your friends," I said. "They tried to break in." Something flickered across his face, guilt, fear, something else, but it was gone too fast to catch. "I didn't," he started. "Save it," I snapped. "You made your choices. Now I'm making mine." He swayed slightly on his feet. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, my voice low and deadly, "you're no longer welcome here." Silence. For a moment, it felt like the whole house held its breath. "You don't mean that," he said, a pitiful crack in his voice. "I do," I said. "And tomorrow morning, the locks change." He stared at me, stunned, as if it was the first time he realized I had limits. As if he thought I would always choose him over my own survival. "Where am I supposed to go?" he whispered. "That's not my burden anymore," I said. I cried that night, silent and wrung out, the tears soaking into the pillow James once slept on. I cried for the boy Calvin had been, for the man he refused to become, for the mother I had been, and the woman I now had to be. In the morning, the locksmith arrived just after sunrise. By the time Calvin returned, bleary and broken, he found only locked doors and silence waiting for him. And somewhere deep inside my battered heart, I prayed that this was the wake-up call he needed. But even as I prayed, I knew better. Some wake up. Some just drift further into the dark. The first few days after Calvin's exile were unbearable in their silence. I moved through the house like a woman trapped inside a clock that had stopped ticking. No footsteps overhead. No slamming doors. No muttered curses behind closed rooms. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the old floorboards under my own slow steps. In a way, it was peaceful. In another, it was terrifying. The house felt hollow, cavernous. I slept with the doors locked. A chair jammed under the front doorknob, not because I thought Calvin would come back with rage in his heart, but because part of me feared he wouldn't come back at all. That he would drift further into the darkness until even his memory became a shadow I could no longer reach. I poured myself into the restaurant. Bradford's hearth needed me more than ever. There were books to balance, debts to chase down, vendors to reassure that despite the rumors swirling around town, we were still solid, still standing. But even as I patched the holes Calvin had left, I could feel the unease brewing just beyond the horizon. It started with a phone call from Miriam Sloan, my lawyer. "Helen," she said carefully, "there's something you should know." My stomach tightened. "There's been an inquiry into the ownership of the restaurant," she said. "Someone's been asking questions about your finances, about the deed." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Who?" "I can't say for certain," she said, "but the timing is concerning." I didn't need her to finish. I knew. Calvin. He was trying to claw his way back in. Or maybe not Calvin himself, maybe the people he owed, whispering in his ear about assets, about inheritance, about what he deserved. That night, I went through the safe in my closet, checking every document, every piece of paper that proved what was mine. I double-checked the updated will, the notarized ownership papers. They were all there. But fear is a clever thing. It finds the cracks even in iron walls. I started seeing things, shadows at the edge of my vision, headlights lingering too long at the end of the driveway. A truck idling down the block that looked too much like the rusted beast Calvin used to borrow. One evening, as I was locking up Bradford's hearth after a long day, I noticed a figure across the street. Standing too still. Watching. For a moment, my heart leapt. Calvin? But when I squinted against the dim streetlight, I realized it wasn't him. It was someone else. Someone rougher around the edges. Someone whose smile, when it finally stretched across his face, was all teeth and no warmth. I locked the restaurant door with trembling hands and drove home with my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The message was clear. The people Calvin had tangled with weren't finished. Not with him. Not with me. And if they couldn't reach him, they'd reach for what he valued. What they thought he was entitled to. Me. I knew then that the real storm hadn't even begun. And when it came, it wouldn't just knock politely at my door. It would try to tear everything I had left to pieces. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder. It came quietly, slipping in through the cracks I hadn't noticed, building itself out of whispers and paperwork. It was a Friday afternoon when Miriam called again. "Helen," she said, and I knew from her voice that whatever followed would not be something I wanted to hear. "You need to come to the office. Today." I hung up the phone with a hand that barely obeyed me and drove through town as if underwater. The streets blurred past. The antique shop where James bought me a brooch on our 30th anniversary, the diner where Calvin and I used to sit at the counter and share milkshakes. Landmarks of a life that suddenly felt fragile, erasable. When I stepped into Miriam's office, she was waiting with a folder thick with legal documents. Her mouth was set in a grim line. "Calvin has filed a petition," she said, "to challenge your sole ownership of Bradford's Hearth." I sat down heavily. "He what?" "He's claiming the restaurant as a familial inheritance," Miriam explained carefully. "He's arguing that, as your son and heir, he has a legal right to part ownership, immediate ownership, if he can prove you're acting against his interest." Acting against? I could barely form the words. "I've done nothing but protect it." "I know," Miriam said. "But the burden of proof now shifts to you." I stared at the folder. The papers inside were real, official, stamped and filed. This wasn't a threat scrawled in anger. This was strategy. Someone was helping him. Someone who knew how to wound me in ways fists and threats never could. I left the office in a daze, clutching the folder like a wound pressed against my chest. As I drove back to the restaurant, I realized I had been wrong. The real betrayal wasn't the theft. It wasn't the drugs. It wasn't even the danger he dragged to my door. It was this cold, calculated attempt to take the only piece of my soul I had left. That evening, Bradford's hearth was warm and golden, filled with laughter and the clink of wine glasses. None of the patrons knew that the foundation beneath their feet was crumbling. I sat in my corner office, staring out the small window at the gathering dusk, thinking about all the nights James and I had stayed late, arguing over menu changes, celebrating small victories, dreaming of passing it down to our child. Passing it down. Not having it stolen by him. There was a knock at the door. One of the waitresses, Tammy, poked her head in. "Miss Helen, there's a man here asking for you. Says he's an old friend of your son's." My heart sank. "Tell him I'm not available." She hesitated. He's being real insistent." Before I could reply, the door pushed open, and there he was. The man from across the street. Scarred eyebrow. Leather jacket. "Mrs. Bradford," he drawled, tipping an invisible hat. "Name's Vince. We've got some business to discuss." Tammy fled wide-eyed. I rose slowly. "I have nothing to discuss with you." "See, that's where you're wrong," he said, stepping into the office, closing the door behind him. "You and Calvin, you got a real valuable place here. Real valuable. And my partners and I were interested in helping you manage it." "Manage it," I repeated, my voice flat. He smiled all teeth. "Think of it like a partnership." "No." His smile didn't falter, but the air around him turned cold. "You might want to reconsider," he said softly. "Bad things happen when people get stubborn." I looked him dead in the eye. "Get out." For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. But he just chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You're a tough old bird," he said. "But everyone breaks eventually. Even you." He tipped his head again and left, the door swinging shut behind him. I sank into my chair, trembling. The restaurant bustled beyond the walls, oblivious. I had spent my life building something beautiful. Now, piece by piece, it was being torn apart by greed, by betrayal, by my own blood. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to save it. The days that followed were an ugly, grinding blur. Every corner of the restaurant seemed touched by rot now, though the customers didn't see it. They laughed and drank and ate my grandmother's bread pudding recipe under twinkling lights, unaware that the very ground beneath them had started to crack. The staff started whispering. They noticed the way I jumped at every knock, the way I lingered too long by the front windows after dark. Tammy asked if I was all right once, her young face creased with worry, and I smiled that brittle smile people wear when the answer would only scare the asker. At night, I lay awake in my room, the house too quiet, listening for Calvin's footsteps that would never come. I thought about James, how proud he would have been of me for fighting, how furious he would have been at what our boy had become. Somewhere deep in my chest, the sorrow hardened into something sharper. Something closer to resolve. I wasn't going to hand over Bradford's hearth. Not to Calvin. Not to the wolves he'd invited to my door. I needed a plan. It started small. Paperwork. Miriam helped me quietly transfer the restaurant's assets into a private trust with ironclad protections. It wasn't fast and it wasn't foolproof, but it would slow them down. Make it harder for Calvin's partners to get their claws into the bones of my life's work. Then I went through the staff roster, pruning quietly. Anyone I suspected of leaking information gone. I paid out their severances with a steady hand and a dead heart. Loyalty had to be earned now, not assumed. I called vendors personally, reinforcing our contracts. I scheduled a routine audit of inventory and finances, letting the entire town hear about it secondhand. Let them think I was paranoid, meticulous, on edge. Let them wonder what secrets I was hiding. I needed them to. Meanwhile, Calvin's shadows grew longer. Vince and his cronies loitered around town more often, sitting outside the hearth in battered trucks, smoking and laughing too loud. It was a game to them. A waiting game. But I'd lived through worse. One rainy afternoon, as I was locking up early, Vince leaned against the brick archway of the entrance, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Clock's ticking, Mrs. Bradford," he said. "You can't hole up forever." "Watch me," I replied, voice cold as the rain dripping off the eaves. He chuckled and disappeared into the mist. Inside, the restaurant smelled like lemon oil and wood smoke. Safe. Familiar. Mine. And that's when I realized I couldn't just defend it. I had to be willing to burn it down if it came to that. Better ashes on my terms than ruins on theirs. That night, I dug through the bottom drawer of James' old roll-top desk. Buried under stacks of restaurant permits and faded menus, I found it. A sealed envelope marked contingency plan. James had been no fool. Inside were documents I'd forgotten. We even had legal instructions for transferring full ownership of the restaurant to a buyer of our choice in the event of irreconcilable family disputes. A clause we had added in a fit of paranoia when Calvin was a teenager and starting to show signs of reckless entitlement. A parachute. I could sell Bradford's hearth. Protect its legacy. Remove it from Calvin's grasp forever. The idea gutted me. Selling would mean severing the last living piece of James, of my parents, of all the Sundays spent rolling napkin rings by hand. But it would also mean survival. And wasn't that what I'd been fighting for all along? I sat there until the sun rose, the paper spread before me, the house filling with pale light. If Calvin thought he could bleed me dry, if Vince thought he could scare me into surrender, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I was Helen Bradford. I had built this life with bare hands and bloody knuckles. And I would burn it to the ground before I let them steal it from me. The morning after my sleepless night, I stood at the front window with a cup of coffee cradled in my hands. The gray light of early dawn made everything look thin and brittle. Even the old oak trees, once proud and sprawling, seemed frail now, as if they too understood that the world we had built was slipping away. I was about to turn away when I saw it, a battered envelope wedged in the screen door. No postmark. No return address. I opened the door slowly, half expecting Vince to be lurking behind the rose bushes. But the street was empty. I picked up the envelope with cautious fingers. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Calvin's. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, torn and smudged. _Ma. I know you think I'm a screw-up. I probably am. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. I got in deep. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I thought they'd back off if I gave them what they wanted. But they want everything. They always want everything. I'm sorry. I know you won't believe me. I don't even know if I believe it myself anymore. I'm leaving town for a while. It's better this way. For you. For the hearth. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to be who you needed me to be. Maybe I never did. Love, Calvin _ I read the letter 3 times, each pass peeling away a little more of the anger I had built up around my heart. And then I folded it neatly, placed it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the drawer of the side table, next to the letters I used to write to James late at night when the house felt too big and too empty. I didn't cry. Maybe because part of me had been expecting this. Maybe because the tears had already been spent, wrung out of me by 1,000 smaller betrayals that had led to this final quiet goodbye. Or maybe because there was a strange, cruel mercy in it. Calvin was gone. And with him went the last thread binding me to a fight I could never win. I locked the front door, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with the contingency papers. It was time. Time to choose survival. Time to let the hearth go before it could be taken from me by force. Outside, the first leaves of autumn had begun to fall, swirling in little eddies across the porch. Change had come to Waverly Falls. And this time, I wasn't going to fight it. I was going to meet it head-on, unflinching. Because sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do isn't to hold on. Sometimes it's to know exactly when to let go. Selling Bradford's Hearth wasn't a decision I made easily. It felt like slicing away a part of myself, an amputation done with full consciousness. I met with a broker Miriam recommended, a kind woman named Eliza Price with gray hair and kind eyes who understood what this place meant. We'll be discreet, she promised. We'll find someone who respects the legacy. Respect. That was all I asked. The listing went up quietly. No fanfare. No for sale sign staked in the ground like a spear in the heart. Just a whisper on the right lips, a murmur through the right channels. It didn't take long. Bradford's Hearth was a prize, even now even battered. The offers trickled in, restaurateurs from the city wanting a rustic outpost, an investment group with dollar signs in their eyes. I turned down the ones that didn't feel right. And then, one rainy Thursday, Eliza called me with a name I hadn't heard in decades. Clara Whitmore, she said. She wants to buy it. Clara, James' old sous chef. The woman who used to whistle while she kneaded bread in the early mornings. She'd moved away years ago to run her own place but had always sent Christmas cards, little handwritten notes about how much she missed the smell of our oak-fired grill. I met Clara at the hearth after hours. We sat in the booth by the fireplace, the one James always favored. I won't change much, she said, running her hand lovingly over the dark wood table. Just freshen it up a little. Keep the soul intact. I nodded, tears pricking the backs of my eyes. I want to keep it called Bradford's Hearth, she added softly. If that's all right with you. My voice broke a little when I answered. It's more than all right. We signed the paperwork under the low light of the old chandelier. The ink barely dry before I felt something inside me loosen, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. The official transfer was set for the end of the month. I spent the intervening weeks cleaning out the office, boxing up decades of memories. I found old photos of James laughing behind the bar, of Calvin as a boy helping decorate for Christmas, of myself, younger, unlined, still believing that love and hard work alone could shield a family from sorrow. I didn't throw the photos away. I packed them into a cedar chest and took them home to the house that still smelled like lemon oil and loss. On my final night at the hearth, I stood behind the host's stand, running my fingers along the familiar grooves worn into the wood. The last table had been cleared, the last candle snuffed. I whispered a quiet thank you to the walls, to the ghosts, to the life I had lived here. And then I turned off the lights. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the fallen leaves into little whirlwinds, carrying them down Main Street toward the river. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped into the night, feeling lighter than I had in years. The hearth would live on, not as mine, but still beating, still warm. And me? I was free. Not unscarred. Not unbroken. But free. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where James had proposed, where Calvin had taken his first steps, where I had written letters no one would ever read. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear. And somewhere in some new place, I hoped Calvin was looking up at the same sky. Maybe, just maybe, he would find his way back to the light. But whether he did or not, I knew one thing for certain. I had found mine.